about Eliphas Levi, and I'm going to just get this right out of the way. The reason that I'm pronouncing it Eliphas Levi is because that's the phonetic transliteration of Alphonse Louis, which is his name, and that's how he kind of made it into a Hebrew version. People can argue with me about how to pronounce it, and I find that to be a completely nonsensical argument, so it doesn't matter. I don't really care how you pronounce it. I just want to get that out of the way so I don't have to argue about this tonight or on YouTube later. To really put... Levi was one of the most influential occultists of all time, really, seconded only by Aleister Crowley. And Crowley himself believed himself to be the reincarnation of Levi. And I actually, although when I hear claims like that, I tend to be very skeptical. However, I think there are numerous points where you can see that Levi's work is a strong antecedent to Crowley's work, and there are connections that I'm going to be making throughout this talk. To understand the context of Levi's work, though, you have to understand that he was born 20 years after the French Revolution and in France. So and there is no way to really interpret what he was doing without sort of understanding the political context of this. Levi was a strong counter-revolutionary. He was jailed twice for writing counter-revolutionary tracts. He was a political activist as well as being an occultist and as well as being a writer and a speaker. Before... And also, you need to sort of understand that Levi intended to join the priesthood. He backed out at the last minute before being ordained. There are numerous stories about why that happened. Some people say he met a woman. Some people say he was doubting himself or doubting the church and whatnot. There's really no confirmed story about this because for Levi, we don't have his kind of personal thoughts and feelings in the same way that we have with certain other occultists. I mean, we have in these meetings before talked about John Dee, for example, and about how it becomes difficult to study him simply because all we have in his magical records are his personal diaries. Well, this is kind of all that polar opposite problem. We don't have his personal diaries, we don't have his personal thoughts. All we have is the things that he had out there to be published. Before the French Revolution, the church owned a great deal of land in France, and they were able to put tithes on the people in the state, and they had a huge source of revenue that way. This was after the revolution, all of the church's property became property of the state. Monastic vows were considered null and void, so monks and nuns were just kind of chucked out. And this was a really big deal because previous to this, it was sort of a tradition that if there was a third child in the family, they would be sent to either the monastery or the nunnery. So a lot of these people were just from families that couldn't afford to keep them, and so they had really nowhere to turn. So there was a huge outpouring, and there was a huge outpouring of anger against the church, where people who would even just be going to mass were getting beaten in the streets for that, and priests were executed by drowning on a regular basis. There was a big uproar, and there were abuses on both sides. You can't really say that there are no good guys in this situation, but it was in this climate, and this is what my point in bringing this up is. It was in this political climate where Levi decided to try to get into the priesthood. So actually, where we tend to see going into be a Catholic priest as sort of a reactionary thing or a conservative thing, it was actually, for him, he was going against his society at the time very strongly. One of the people who Levi hated the most was Voltaire, although he does have a couple nice things to say about him now and then, but I think that's very significant because Voltaire was sort of the saint of the revolution at the time, and that Levi was so strongly critical of him is important to look at and think about, because Levi was a very strong social critic, very not just anti-revolution, but anti-democracy, which Crowley brings up again later. Crowley was very anti-democracy as well. Levi called it the rule of the ignorant over the intelligent. And there is something to be said about that. It's interesting to look at what we can and cannot criticize in our society. And democracy is one of those things that you cannot criticize or people rain on you. So that's what I always like to think about is what is the devil, really? And who is the gods? Jung says that you know who your gods are by what offends you. And there are a lot of people, it's very fashionable to walk around these days and say that nothing offends me, nothing upsets me, but it's that's not true. There's always something's going to get under your skin, and that's the evidence of who the real God is and who you really worship. I mean, there can be someone even considering themselves to be a devout Christian who doesn't get offended if you make jokes about Jesus, but maybe they're a huge Tool fan. And Lord knows if you say anything about Maynard James Keenan, then all of a sudden you're the devil. This religious climate also led to a influx. A lot has been talked about sort of satanic cults that existed in France at the time, and this was a big deal in the church at the time, where priests would, not having a source of regular income, sell their services as occultists to people with money to try to make money for themselves, and that was a huge sort of current of what was happening, and Levi was very strongly opposed to that, and it led him to kind of believe that the church had been infested with a sort of satanic virus or satanic germ that was creating a huge problem. Now Levi's work marks a very interesting turning point in occultism, because although he had occult writings and spoke about Kabbalistic stuff and stuff that would traditionally lead you to be imprisoned or tormented by papal authorities or whatever, it was his political writings that landed him in prison. And this is a current that continues to this day. There's sort of a lot of people in different occult communities that like to pretend that they're going to get persecuted for their wacky beliefs or whatever. This is very rarely the case, I find. I think that it's overblown. It's people who want to believe that they're going to be persecuted, but in actuality, if you go against the grain in a more political sense, you're more likely to receive a reaction than just like practicing witchcraft or whatever like that. So this is kind of like when this turns around, because before this, and this isn't a coincidence. The reason for this is because after the French Revolution, this touched off a lot of political reconfiguration all around Europe, and the church lost a great deal of power in most places. Levi was really the first to expound upon the idea that the occult should be treated like a science. John Dee definitely treated it that way, but he didn't really write his theories out or explain to people why it should be the case or how he was doing it. Levi makes a big point of saying that this should be treated in the same way that you would treat any other science. Let's see, like you do a magical experiment the same way that you do an experiment in chemistry or an experiment in physics. Crowley picks up on this and runs with it, and that's sort of why Crowley is the ultimate combination, because he not only explains his theory and explains his practice, but we also have his diaries, we have his thoughts, and we have what he was going through at the time, which is the thing that is kind of like the missing parts from both Dee and Levi are there in Crowley's work. Really the only time that we get any kind of personal stuff from Levi is when he talks about his necromantic work with Apollonius of Tyana, and just explains, like, when he's trying to explain necromancy in his Doctrine and Ritual of Transcendental Magic. And that's literally the only reason I bring that up specifically is it's like literally the only personal nugget that you get from Levi. And for a lot of the case, his magic tends to be about making yourself up to be the thing and whatever it is that you're trying to invoke, and it's a very simple principle. Later on, the Golden Dawn used his work as sort of a template to do their stuff, and they solved some of the problems that he came up with in their system, and we're going to get to that. But the number one thing that Levi sort of teaches, and to him is like, if you can do this, then you can do magic, basically, and you don't really need a whole lot of other instruction or system, is to master the passions, as he calls it. And he calls that the great secret of occultism. It's basically ethics. And it's not even that he's necessarily saying that your ethics have to match a particular thing, although he very strongly intimates that. There's a lot of subtext in Levi, which I don't know if it's there necessarily because he believed it or because he didn't want to get in trouble, and I'm kind of very convinced that there are certain things that he says that you kind of read between the lines, and he's a little more out there than he would necessarily present himself to be, but he's trying to not get in trouble. Arthur Edmund Waite, who is the main translator of Levi, comments on this a couple of times, that he thinks that in Levi's early writings, it was before he was initiated into whatever mystery cult he was initiated into. Again, like, this is one of these details that we really don't have. And it was probably most likely a Martinist cult, because one of his compatriots, Pappus, or Gerardicus, who was a Gnostic saint in the Gnostic Mass, in Crowley's Gnostic Mass, he was definitely part of that. But most of their material was destroyed after the Nazis invaded France in World War II, so we kind of can't really check on that too closely, unfortunately. But the idea of mastering the passions is very much what Crowley comes up with later with calming the mind. And in Crowley's system, he uses yoga to do this a lot. In Levy's system, it's more just a matter of like not doing the things that excite you too much. You've got to have a calm mind. For Levy, that meant stepping back from the world. For Crowley, it meant stepping into the world. And in Crowley's system, it's kind of like, well, you master the passions by not getting excited about things because you do everything until you're completely bored. Like, you have all the orgies, you do all the drugs, you do everything that you could possibly do to stimulate yourself until you just can't be stimulated anymore, and nothing will distract you from that point. Whereas Levy kind of goes in the opposite direction. And that's, they're both legitimate. I mean, Crowley tells stories about this Russian Christian cult where they were very anti-sex. So their way of, and you know, they cited a passage in the Bible which says that to think about having sex was the same as having sex in a sinful sort of way. So what they would do is just have a huge weekly orgy, so that everyone has sex and it's not in their minds anymore. They don't have to like think about it or get distracted by it. What this basically comes down to is very much the idea of karma. And karma is a very misused word, unfortunately. What it actually means is attachment. So it's whatever we attach to is what we have karma about. And it's not a good or a bad thing. There's no such thing as good or bad karma. It's all just attachment to the world. And what Levy's kind of trying to ask us to do, his great secret, is to detach everything. So that way one can perform any actions without having any kind of necessary investment in them. And Crowley comes up with this again later with the idea of the lust for result as the main problem in magic. It's like you do a ritual or you try to perform something and then you're just worried about how it's going to come out or what's going to happen with it. It screws up what you're trying to do, basically. So